Factories went idle, retail, food and beverage, financial services, credit, all shut down. It would be easier to list the companies not pausing operations or pulling out of Russia entirely as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. With us for more on the economic blowback in Russia and beyond, in New York, Charlotte Howard, U.S. business editor and New York bureau chief for The Economist. And in Ontario's capital city, Mark Warner, international competition, trade and investment lawyer with MAAW Law. And Brian Milner, longtime business and economics writer. Welcome to you all. So this first question is for all of you, but Charlotte, I wanted to start with you. It seems like the private sector reacted to the invasion of Ukraine incredibly quickly. Have you ever seen anything like this before?
It's really been of a scale and speed that is unprecedented. You saw companies that had spent decades building up their business in Russia all of a sudden abandoning it in a matter of days. BP in particular, this huge international oil company, had a really close partnership with Rosneft, had a big stake in Rosneft, Russia's state-backed oil company. And between Thursday, the day that Russia invaded, and Sunday, they took the decision basically to just leave that stake. It's unclear how much of their investment they'll be able to recoup.
And Mark, have you seen this before?
Not on the scale or the speed. I agree with Charlotte. I haven't really seen this before. I would caution, though, that we're not sure what this really means just yet. Some of the companies are leaving completely, or they say they are. Some are suspending operations. And so you really have to drill down in the corporate communications to try to figure out exactly what they're doing. But it's certainly what is new and unique is that companies are saying that they want to distance themselves from Russia. The extent of it, how far and how deep it goes, I think remains yet to be seen.
Okay, and Mark, you brought up some great points. We're going to get into that in just a few moments. But Brian, what about you? Have you seen this before?
No, never on this scale. We're talking about more than 300 companies that are basically pulling up stakes or suspending operations literally in a matter of days. Now, some of them are doing it for financial reasons. The Russian market is obviously going to get much weaker. The economy is going to plummet. And so for good business reasons, they would have been cutting back anyway. Also, they have some financing issues because banks aren't doing business with Russian banks. And so there's that issue. But on the other hand, the other big issue is the reputation issue. Will my reputation suffer if I stay? And the answer right now is yes.
We will get into that in just a second. Charlotte, what is the difference between the government sanctions imposed on Russia as compared to the private sector pullout?
Well, the two are related, right? So the West has imposed really draconian sanctions on Russia of a scale that we've not seen before, even as the use of sanctions has really ramped up over the past decade. What they're doing now is of a different scale, in large part because they're going after not just the private banks, but the central bank. And so you've seen this really steep decline in the ruble as Russia's economy becomes more isolated. But the private sector actions are important, and I think they're important both substantively in that they will help to precipitate real economic damage within Russia. And then I think they're also important politically because it's very hard for Vladimir Putin to argue that this is just a small scale operation in Ukraine and don't worry about it when all of a sudden a Russian consumer walks down the street and they see that the Starbucks is closed, the McDonald's is closed. They can't go into Zara to buy something. You see their bank accounts taking a real hit as the ruble declines, and then just everyday life in Russia looks dramatically different.
And also if maybe they lost their job because those companies or shut down in Russia. But you said something that I wanted to follow up with. You said that these are draconian measures. How are they draconian measures?
Well, in the past, if you look at the sanctions that were imposed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea, governments tried to be more targeted. So, for instance, they might sanction individuals who are close to Vladimir Putin, or they sanctioned the use of certain type of energy activities in Russia. So the sanctions after 2014, they really went after deep oil and Arctic exploration, for instance, to make it much harder for energy companies to work with Russia on some of those projects. ExxonMobil, because of those sanctions, pulled out of certain projects in Russia. But right now you see not just targeted sanctions, but really going across the whole board. And in particular, I'd highlight those actions against the central bank.
And Brian, you mentioned reputation. We know now that on social media, a hashtag can destroy a company. We would like to think maybe that these companies are pulling out for more reasons, but you mentioned reputation. So why do you think companies have been so quick to pull the plug?
Well, as I said, reputation is important to these companies and the safety of their brand name. But what we're seeing is the fact that Russia doesn't have a really strong economy. It doesn't produce a huge amount of profit for these companies. In general, it's a small portion of their international business. So they can say, let's get out of here for a while. You didn't see them do that in China when sanctions were put on that country over its treatment of the Uyghurs. You don't see it in some other countries with terrible human rights records if the economy is really booming and they make a lot of money there. So yes, Apple's not selling any more of its products in Russia, but they're still selling a lot of them in China.
Well, when you're comparing the effect of government sanctions versus the private sector withdrawal, Charlotte mentioned that if you're in Russia right now and if you go to McDonald's and you notice that McDonald's is not there, obviously you know that something is up. What do you think will have the most immediate effect on everyday Russians, the effect of government sanctions or the private sector withdrawal? Brian.
Well, the fact is that they both have an impact. And as Charlotte said, the impact of retailers leaving the market is a lot of empty shops, a lot of people losing their jobs, and telling people what's going on. The government's telling us that everything's fine and there's no war in Ukraine. It's just a simple military action. So why are Western companies doing this to us? Now, the Russian answer to that is, well, they're just ganging up on us and showing and illustrating why they're so dangerous. But from the Russian perspective, if you go on Friday nights and line up at McDonald's for your Big Mac and you suddenly can't get it, you're going to start asking more questions.
And Mark, Brian mentioned China. There are still companies, I'm afraid to ask this question because things are moving so fast, but we know companies that have pulled out, but there are companies who have decided to stay. What do you think that signals to companies that have decided to stay in a country like China?
Well, I think that there are different kinds of companies that face different challenges. So, for instance, if you're in an auto company, say you're making Volkswagens over there, you can say you're shuttering it down, shuttering your plant. What at the worst the Russians can do or the government can do is take it over. But if there are no parts coming in, they can't really make the Volkswagen and sell it in Russia. So there's some sense that if you close the factory, if this comes to an end and people decide that they want to have peace again, you can go back in fairly quickly. So I think when you see some of what the companies that you leave or say that they're shutting things down, it's so far, some of it is, it's not necessarily as huge, it's big, it's a big move. It's just not necessarily as, how should I say, as consequential in terms of the long term as I think people in the moment might think it is. Like if you're in the extractive sector or even in the oil drilling sector, a lot of what major companies were doing was things that the Russians wouldn't be able to take over. So if you stop doing it, at some point, either the Chinese will come in, and that's a concern, or the Russians will just have to stop it until such point as the Western companies can come back in. Some companies reflect their nation state. So, Exxon has to answer to shareholders to a large extent, the United States, and BP has to answer to the government of Britain to some extent, and so does Shell. But if you take a look at France, total France, they're looking at it and they're saying, oh, we're not really getting out. We might not make new investments, but we put a lot of work into this. You see the French banks saying similar things. So part of this also follows, the culture of the companies. I'm reading very closely to see some of the companies like McDonald's. I remember the first time I went to South Africa after Mandela came to power, and you had all of these companies, these shops, these retail shops that looked kind of sort of like something you might have seen in North America. But in fact, they were just the companies that have been taken over. And then, of course, the companies had to spend a lot of money and time once the sanctions were lifted in terms of getting their brand and their name back. So that's one of the reasons why I think you saw McDonald's and Starbucks a little bit later to act, because that's kind of what their risk is: the intellectual property, the trademarks, the branding, and that sort of thing.
Charlotte, I wanted you to pick it up from there. How big is the Russian economy compared to the U.S. and China?
Well, China's economy is about 10 times the size of Russia's. So I think that, to my colleague's earlier point, there's a reason why some companies are really fine pulling out of Russia, whereas they might stay in China for a long time. Apple, of course, has an enormous consumer base within China and then also produces all of its iPhones there. So it's just a much different calculation. Also, to date, China has not declared active war, right, on a neighbor. So that's important to keep in mind as well. Human rights abuses, of course, have been factoring into companies' decisions, but there's not been an outright conflict in the same way. I think that it's worth keeping in mind, though, that even though Russia's economy is small, it is an absolutely enormous supplier of commodities on which the world depends. So, of course, oil, it's the world's third biggest oil producer. It is an enormous producer of wheat. It's the world's biggest supplier of wheat. It also is home to all kinds of metals that are crucial for the global economy: nickel, aluminum, copper, you name it. So, and of course, Europe is very dependent on Russian gas. So even though the sanctions within Russia can prompt some companies to leave without too much pain, the broader implications of isolating Russia are huge because of the commodities it supplies.
And Brian, at the heart of this, there are a lot of people in Russia who are not to blame for what's happening in Ukraine. When these companies do pull out and people lose their jobs, I wanted to talk to a bit more about how economically healthy is the middle class in Russia.
Well, the middle class is not in great shape these days because the economy has been struggling for some time, the domestic economy. Russia is really dependent on exports of raw materials, natural resources, and hasn't really evolved into a strong industrial base, hasn't developed a strong industrial base. It's sort of was moving toward that, and that's one of the reasons that it has been importing Western technology. It's been developing nascent industries and building high-speed trains and its own high-tech equipment and consumer goods, but it's way behind. I mean, when you look at the per capita GDP of Russia, it's about $11,000 a person, which doesn't sound terrible, but in Canada, it's about $45,000. And the fact is that 220 Russians control 40% of the entire wealth of the country, which means not a lot gets down into the lower levels of society. The middle class is doing just fine in the big cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. But if you go out into the countryside, you're looking at a pretty poor country.
Mark and Charlotte, this question is for you. I'll start with you, Mark. For the companies that decide to leave, what's going to happen to the capital assets of those companies? Mark?
Well, I think that the Russian government has said that they're looking at nationalizing them if the companies go. I think the deputy prime minister, I think, said last week that the companies have two choices, or three choices. They can stay, or they can leave but hand things over to local Russian managers and owners and come back when it's all over. Or three, if they exit entirely, they need to get rid of all their employees and they need to leave for good. And I guess the implication being that the Russians will just take it over completely. So we'll have to see where they go with that. That's something will play out over the next day or two. There's still some cards that the Russians haven't played yet, right? So Charlotte did mention, I think, some of the important other raw materials. We are living in a global economy, and it's not just a talking point. It's actually real. So Boeing uses titanium, which largely comes from Russia at this point, to make their planes, and they say they have an adequate supply. Air France is another company, happens to be French again. They're saying, I'm not Air France, Airbus, European company, but based largely in France. They're saying they're staying in Russia and using the titanium supply from Russia because they need it. So there are a range of concerns that companies have, and we'll see how it plays out over time. I think just how far it really goes. I'm trying to, as I said, read some of these press releases a lot closely to just see what some of the companies are actually really doing, whether they're shutting down new business or our existing business.
Mark, you've mentioned that a couple of times. Do you not believe what the companies are saying?
Well, I think here's what I think. The lesson I've learned over the last 2 years, first with the pandemic and this, is the corporate communications business must be doing really well. So I think you need to be a bit skeptical, and you need to discount probably by about 25-50% of what you're reading, and ask questions. If you read a comment about what a company's doing and it doesn't actually say what it's doing, then I think you should ask more questions.
And Charlotte, to pick up on that, to be a little skeptical of what the companies are communicating, what is going to happen to the capital assets of those companies that do decide to leave?
Well, it depends, right? American companies don't have what's called a bilateral investment treaty. America doesn't have a bilateral investment treaty with Russia, which would allow an American company to protest against a Russian takeover, a Russian seizure of its assets in international arbitration. So an American company would be at the mercy of Russian courts unless it owns its Russian assets through a foreign subsidiary that does have such a treaty. So that sounds a little technical, but basically it points to the real quandary that some companies face, which is the Russian government takes over something that you own. What can you do about it? Can you recover any of that value? I think one of the reasons why the press releases are a little hard to read is because I think a lot of companies really don't have good answers to these questions at the moment. They're figuring this out in real time. I was speaking with some people at BP, and they are going to try to figure out what the value of their assets are at the end of the month, at the end of March. They're not sure who they'll be able to sell it to, what will happen with those assets. It's a lot of money. It's up to $25 billion that they might leave. We're not talking about pocket change. So I think it varies a lot. There are a lot of aircraft lessors, which are businesses that lease planes to Russian carriers, and they're trying to recover hundreds of planes that are in Russia. How on earth do you do that? I think that there are big write-downs that we're going to see in the next couple of months from some of these companies.
Mark, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say about that because I think it's worth noting again that if you take a look at some of what these companies are doing when they say that they're going to write it down, they're not going to record the value of the assets, and they're not going to receive dividends, and that's great from a corporate communications point of view, from a corporate prestige or reputation of the brand. But it also means that if this reverses fairly quickly, they haven't actually disposed of those shares or those assets and can reverse it fairly quickly. It becomes an accounting exercise. So that's part of what you need to watch for as well.
All right, so let's move on to the issue that everybody's talking about right now, is the oil and gas issue. Brian, what percentage of the global supply of oil and gas does Russia control?
Well, they are the third largest oil producer in the world and a major gas producer. Roughly, and I'm not 100% sure of this number these days, but it's roughly about 10 to 12% of all the oil. And of course, they are the major supplier of oil and gas to Western Europe.
And Charlotte, President Biden recently announced that it will ban Russian oil imports to the U.S., which will send the price of gasoline even higher. How tolerant of high gas prices are Americans? And it sounds awful to ask that question considering what's happening in Ukraine.
Well, all politics are local, right? I think that there's been an interesting amount of bipartisan support for America to be tough on Russia, and you saw some bipartisan support for the idea of an oil embargo. America doesn't actually get that much oil or gas from Russia. It's less than 10% of its imports come from Russia. But oil is a fungible commodity. Prices will go up. They will affect ordinary Americans. And I think President Biden is really contending with high inflation as a political problem going into this year's midterm elections. So I think that people may say in theory that they like the idea of being tough on Russia, but then they go to fill up their car and it's really expensive, and then that becomes a real political problem. You've always seen presidents worry about prices at the pump. Donald Trump, when he was president, would take the extraordinary measure of openly calling on OPEC to increase production to bring oil prices down. This is something that all presidents are focused on. And I think President Biden has a real communications challenge to try to maintain support for tough measures as prices continue to rise.
And the next question is for Mark and Brian. I'll start with you, Mark. In terms of replacing Russian oil from the international market, is Canada in a position to make up the difference?
I don't think we are in the short term. I mean, you hear people talking about Keystone, but the pipeline wasn't finished. So that's more of a middle to longer term solution. Obviously, if we want to get the oil and gas to Europe, we would really need to do something in terms of our own pipeline, or what could help would be an east-west pipeline, which is kind of impossible dream, I think, in Canada. So, there's probably I don't think that we're going to be able to be the country that replaces completely the Russian supply. I just don't think that's something we're able to do. And that's why I think the Americans are going after, which is kind of interesting. They're trying to get Venezuela back on stream, which is kind of ironic because part of the supply into the United States was because the Russian supply in the United States was because they had sanctions on Venezuela. So now as we have sanctions ramped up on Russia, you have American government officials in Caracas trying to see if they can figure out a way to get Venezuelan oil back on stream. And you also have the Iran nuclear talks going on in Geneva. So that's also another source of supply. So those are the aspects that they're looking. But the real spigot that Putin hasn't played yet is the Europeans are in no position to turn off the supply, just to stop buying. And if Putin really wanted to be angry, he could basically say, okay, I see where you're going. I'm going to shut it off. And interesting thing, one last comment of what was announced by Biden is it doesn't include a pipeline that comes from the Caspian Sea, which is very important because it crosses through Russia. And again, that because it crosses through Russia, that means there are nodal points in Russia that Putin can say, well, if you're not going to buy my oil and gas, if you're not going to buy my oil, basically, I'm just not going to let it be transported, this oil coming through from the Caspian Sea through my territory. How do you like that?
And Brian?
Well, in fact, there was a big energy conference in Houston, and the Canadian participants said that they could probably replace about half the Russian oil in the U.S. market over the coming year. And obviously, they would be able to do more if they had the Keystone pipeline and if they had some of these other things sorted out. Also, they have to start producing more on their end. And one of the big problems is that even in the U.S., which really could be self-sufficient if they want to be, frackers stopped producing more oil because they were being pressed by shareholders to give out higher dividends, so they stopped investing as much. Those are things that are going to take several years to reverse if that's the way it has to go.
In our final minute, Charlotte, you wrote in a recent Economist article that, quote, it took more than 30 years for BP, a British energy firm, to build its Russian business. It took less than 4 days to decide to dismantle it. Now that so many companies are leaving, how likely is it that they'll ever go back?
Well, I think as we've discussed, I think some companies are hedging their bets by suspending their businesses rather than leaving them. But I take particular interest in what the energy companies are doing. They're not all doing the same thing. We heard about how Total, a French energy company, is not leaving altogether. But all of these companies are really having their eye on the long-term plans for the energy transition. And as they try to decide where around the world they want to invest, they're thinking about a range of factors that include the cost of drilling, how clean it is to drill, how much methane emissions there are as drilling continues, and the political risks. And I think in Russia, those risks, that math, it just doesn't add up anymore. And I think that they'll be really hard pressed to see some of these companies who are leaving now return with big investments into Russia.
Thank you all so much for helping us understand this complicated issue. We really do appreciate your insights. Thanks so much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.